So let's get to it, gentlemen. Should affirmative action be allowed in the U.S.? As always, we'll begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to allow your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick up the conversation from there. So, Dr. Dibinga, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Well, first of all, the fact of the matter is that America has always had affirmative action, and it's had affirmative action for white people. When white people that came to America, going back to westward expansion, they were granted plots of land. When you look at other forms throughout its history, there have always been provisions made to help white people get ahead in this society. Furthermore, white women have benefited from affirmative action more than any other group in our society. And lastly, there still is affirmative action for white people at Harvard University through legacy admissions, where the people who are admitted don't have to be qualified. They have to be children of people who are influential. So it's like comparing Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to a Jared Kushner, for example. And so those policies still exist. Both my parents got doctorates from Harvard. Yeah. When I applied, I didn't get in. We didn't have the complexion of connection.
Complexion of connection. Jobob, your thoughts?
I'll keep this brief for the opening part. Racism is racism, regardless of whether or not you think it's proactive or regressive. The United States as a whole says, hey, you can't be racist, and the Supreme Court upheld that decision. Now, I can probably agree, and we'll probably get into this on the whole legacy admission stuff. I think that's also wrong. But the whole idea that you're going to discriminate against certain races in order to give preferential treatment to other races shouldn't be allowed in the United States, regardless of what race you are.
Last but not least, Dan Perry, your take.
It's a question of the ideal world versus the real world. Of course, colorblindness and individualism are excellent principles, but reality requires a bit more nuance. Affirmative action is based on the idea that past achievement does not always reflect potential because and true merit, because certain marginalized groups haven't had the chance, and therefore they need a leg up or a second look. How to do it and how much to do it is, of course, the big question. So as with most things in life, a balance is required.
Yes, the veil of ignorance taking center stage once again. And gentlemen, let's feel free to interact from this point onwards. And before we get to the basic notion of whether it is just or not, Dr. Dibinga, has affirmative action failed?
Well, it depends on what people are looking at as failure. And one of the challenges when people look at affirmative action is that they always associate it with Black students only, or Black people if you're talking about the corporate world. They only look at it that way. But we also have to be mindful of the fact that people always attach affirmative action to unqualified Black students. And as Mr. Perry was saying just a moment ago, he talked about giving people a second look. In many situations, it's giving students a first look. People who normally would not, like a Clarence Thomas, who normally, because of where they were attending school or the community that they were in, were not going to be able to make it through the application process at Harvard because they didn't have the resources and the knowledge base. And so when you look at people like a Joy Ann Reid, a very popular news host in the United States, she talks about how people from Harvard came to her school and interviewed her. She already had the grades. She was already a stellar student to see if she would be a good fit for the campus. So to do things like that, I don't believe that that's a failure. And even when you look at this case with Harvard, the last 2 points I will make, many Asian students didn't have a problem with the policy. And then lastly, when you go to UNC, you're going to see a decline in Black students, but you're not going to see a change in the taxpayer base because that's a public school. Black people and white people paying the same tax rate, but the admissions are going to be better for white people. Admissions to college is not just about test scores. It's about the well-rounded student.
But
many of these students have the test scores as well.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Jobob, please. Yeah.
There's a lot of components to getting into college, and race is the only thing they took out of the equation. Clarence Thomas, in his writings on this, said that you can still say that I grew up in a difficult situation. I had a family that didn't have any resources, or whatever you want to say, and that can all be taken into consideration. Why race has anything to do with those particulars is beyond me. There are rich Black people in this country. There are poor Black people. There are rich Asians. There are poor Asians. There are rich white people, there are poor white people. So to say that the color of your skin is solely determinative of how you can achieve in this culture is not accurate.
Look, I can help you out here because there's a reason why people think that. There is an enormous income gap in the U.S. and an even greater and completely inadmissible wealth gap. And it's understandable if you're talking about immigrants who came from poor and underdeveloped countries. But 10 generations down the road, if this is persistently the case, and if it diminishes not with great speed, then clearly there has been a failure. Ellie, it's not affirmative action that's failed. It's American society that has failed. And clearly there is an education failure. Clearly there is not enough being done in terms of frameworks and incentives. And therefore, a corrective action is needed. This is a matter of semantics,
but can you fix an injustice with an injustice? That's the basic question.
Well, the idea is that it isn't necessarily an injustice, because if you are making a special effort to identify the future potential of people who have not had the chance to show past achievement because they come from inner city schools which do not provide the same education as fine private schools, then obviously you're just attempting in some way to level the playing field. I do admit that it can feel terrible to people who were once dominant and now are the beheaded aristocrat. But there is an argument that the societal good is to increase the amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, and that's John Stuart Mill. It's not me speaking.
Well, one is you're assuming that the affirmative action has worked in terms of the average income of varying minorities. Anybody who's received affirmative action doesn't seem to actually have helped, because a lot of times they're comparing it to the white counterparts and not the top. Well, guess what? The top has changed, and Asian Americans and Indian Americans are at the top of the earning standards. So it doesn't really make sense that you would work on that sense. Now, I can agree with you. There are some educational problems that exist in the country. There's educational problems, but they exist a lot in urban areas, which you're correct. A lot of those areas are black. But the left in the United States has consistently and continually been against school choice and getting kids out of failing government schools, which probably would help more minorities get into colleges on merit.
Let's be realistic. Let's be realistic. As somebody who speaks in schools, as somebody who speaks in schools across the country, public, private, and charter schools, the fact of the matter is that there's a real not equal distribution of resources. We put ourselves in situations where, if you want to talk about our schooling systems and our urban education system, the policies that are in place to fund our school systems based on our taxpayer, based on our income. We fund our schools based on income. So if I'm in a poor neighborhood in D.C. and then I drive up the street to a richer neighborhood in Washington, D.C., none of the students in any of those schools did anything to deserve the facilities that they have. But if one group of parents makes $2 million a year and the other groups of parents makes $20,000 a year, the people who make $20,000 a year deserve to have a poorer school, and that sets up what Ketanji Brown Jackson called an intergenerational transmission of inequality. And so we have to be mindful of that. And when you couple this with the decision on student loans, you're making a further, and remember, Ronald Reagan wanted to have more of this college tuition increase because he wanted to have fewer undesirables at these universities. So that double whammy is pushing people further out of having an opportunity to get into this. And when I talk in my book, Lies About Black People, I'm talking specifically about how we've attached affirmative action to the face of Black underachievement when it has been nothing of the sort. People like Clarence Thomas, who was a high achiever, who was very qualified, he is the face of affirmative action. And many Black people and other groups who have benefited from that, they may not be at the top of the income scale, but they are definitely better off than where they would be without these policies.
And by the way, Jobob, there are various studies that show how affirmative action has had results. One of them is the graduation gap that shows that, for example, states in areas and in schools that have affirmative action, it has fallen from 10% to 5 to 6%. I'm not sure why that would be funny. And also, by the way, the income and wealth inequalities, which I bemoaned earlier on, are diminishing. Just not fast enough. You could argue that affirmative action has had something to do with that by creating more polished people from minority backgrounds that are ready for the workplace, and obviously that attaches to income. Realistically, there is not a problem in America of overall of white people having no access to wealth. White people control I think $124 trillion worth of wealth in the U.S. compared to less than $10 trillion for black people. And that's about 4 to 1 on a per capita basis. Yeah. It's just not the problem. The problem is angry, seething masses of minority people who have reason to be unhappy. And I fail to see why we would celebrate the removal of one of the methods that we have tried to ease the problem.
Their skin, yeah, there's a right to celebrate that.
Please, Jobob. Yeah, continue.
Well, first things first, if you're going to go with arbitrary statistics as graduation rates, when you lower the bar for a bunch of different areas across schooling, across the state of California specifically is a great example of D's get degrees nowadays. It's a difficult thing to look at there. But when you're talking about eliminating the ability for people to judge someone based entirely on the color of their skin, that's the whole point of the country. We don't want to have people entirely judged on their skin color. Let's go with merit. And maybe this makes me a bad person. I believe that minorities can succeed in a meritocracy. Oh my gosh.
Jared Kushner did not get into Harvard on merit. You're talking about kids who are going to school with their parents' name on the building. So if you're gonna so if you agree with me, stop going to the merit argument, because 70% of legacy of white students at Harvard are legacy admissions. They may not be qualified. But their parents
it isn't exactly true, by the way. The Harvard study showed that there is a preference for legacy people, and we know that. Nobody thinks they got in having no merit purely because of legacy.
It's getting heated right before we need to take a break. A few minutes, and we'll be back with the summit.